Okay, good morning everybody, and welcome to the next webinar in our WFCP series this autumn. The title of this week's webinar is To Marketize or Not to Marketize, Around the World in 3 Approaches to Technical Education. And I'm really pleased that we have speakers from 3 different countries joining us today, 3 different continents in fact, for today's session. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Don Zollner, who is a University Fellow at Charles Darwin University and a former board member of TAFE Directors Australia. Next, we'll cross the Pacific and hear from Alfredo Pinto, who is Director of Marketing and Communications at Duoc in Chile. And then lastly, we'll move to the UK and hear from my colleague David Cork, who's Director of Education and Skills Policy at the AOC in the UK. So just before we start, a couple of housekeeping things just to check that everybody is aware. We're currently recording this webinar, so if for any reason you have to leave early, you will be able to hear a recording of it and download it. It'll be sent to you and shared with you after today's event. We'd be really grateful if you could turn off your video and microphone during the webinar, just to make sure there's no interference in the sound with the speakers. Please do complete our feedback survey after the webinar. And if you have any questions or comments during the webinar, please do fill in the chat, send us some comments and questions, and we'll pick those up in the Q&A towards the end. If you'd like to tag us on social media as well, the Twitter handle is there on the screen for you below. So the format for today is that we're going to hear from each speaker in turn, but just before we start, we're going to do a brief poll of all of the participants in the webinar. Just to start things off, we'd like you to answer a question for us before you hear anything else in the webinar. Are you pro or anti marketization? So we'll just give you all a minute to fill that in. Okay, results are just coming in. I have my colleague Maria from CCAN in the background, who's our technical manager today. So she's doing all the polls and everything for us. So thanks, Maria, for doing that. We have 22 out of 30 participants who voted. Just give folk another minute. See if we can get that up to 30 or as close to. Okay, Maria, would you like to end the poll in a second? There we go. So the results of the poll show that we are just slightly on this call more pro-marketization than neutral about marketization. So we'll see what people think after they've heard our speakers today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Don, who is going to start the first presentation today. We'll just drop back down the poll. And Don, I wonder whether to kick us off, you might be able to provide us with a definition of marketization, perhaps for people who know less about the subject, and certainly a marketization perspective from your point of view in terms of how it's worked in Australia. So over to you, Don, please.
Okay, thank you. If you can move on the slide, Maria, please. So thanks to TDA for asking me to do this, and I just want to be clear that this is based on my personal research and doesn't represent necessarily the views of TDA or any other organization with which I'm involved. Essentially, the marketization and privatization of services that were previously supplied by government is the nature of what marketization means. Things that used to be considered a public service have been treated, and I'll come back to this in a minute, as a procurement exercise. And for the VET, vocational education and training market, is our shorthand here in Australia, it's been very consistent public policy for both major political parties and virtually all state and territory governments for the past 30 years. And it's a really simple policy that traces its origins back to Milton Friedman, the US economist from the Chicago School of the 1950s, who proposed that, in fact, governments had no business being in education generally, in capitalist societies because private providers operating in a competitive market would always produce better outcomes. Next slide, please, Maria. And so the Australian vocational system, we'll do a quick romp through this. It's a shared state and federal responsibility. The states have legal constitutional responsibility. The Australian government buys a seat at the table because it's got more money. It's fairly crass, but also quite accurate. There's a chronic desire for each of the state and territory jurisdictions to be different that some people see as an advantage because you then have, by definition, 8 different markets that can be much more locally responsive. Other people see it as a great disadvantage in a relatively small population to have such diversity that doesn't always translate and transfer across the jurisdictions. Like I said, this has been bipartisan policy for a long time, that is to outsource the provision of VET. So the state-owned TAFEs, technical and further education institutions, lost their 1980s monopoly, and they currently compete with about 4,000 other providers in the population. And in the scale of the market, the single market, is about 4 million students enroll in VET annually out of about 26 million residents, not all of which, of course, are adults or even school age. So a reasonably high concentration. There's about 30 public providers, the TAFEs, and there are about 3,000 for-profit companies that operate in this space in the overall national market. And the bulk of then the rest of those organizations include schools, NGOs, social enterprises, universities, and some single business enterprise providers. By that I mean a company like Qantas would have its own training provision. And there's a national standards-based regulation for most of the providers and for regulating the qualifications. And the next slide, please. So this is a very simple, very classic open and competitive market for delivery of VET. And VET was designed and defined in Australia by not being a school or a university. So in fact, it was every other type of post-school education that wasn't university. So in fact, it swept up many things into it: language and literacy, numeracy outcomes, adult education, hobby courses, was just all swept into this one, conceptually, this one market. But it actually consists of multiple markets because you've got all these historic antecedents that were there, including workers' educational institutions. There's a whole association, there's a whole host of things that have been jammed into this one policy space. So the public policy has attempted to produce a single market because that's easier to navigate and to regulate and to make policy for, but it also has reduced the discussion around this area of how you best deliver VET to a very simple binary argument. You're either for the market or against the market, as we used in our poll, but that's the nature of the debate. So essentially, though, we have new public management procurement processes that outsource publicly financed vocational education and training. That's been the dominant factor. And learning units, and by that I mean the competencies that students are exposed to and that have been monetized. So you can actually put a cost on each of these units so you can go to the market. And they're sit inside competency-based. There's about 55 training packages that tightly link specified competencies to qualifications. And the next slide, please. So how was it implemented? There's been a series of national councils, policy forums, ministerial councils, but essentially making public money available to the market has driven the behavior in the space. So again, the outsourcing of the publicly financed stuff goes through very standard procurement tendering processes. There's contractual monitoring and national reporting. So it's a quasi-market that each of the state and territory governments is set up, and sometimes the federal government will also intervene into the space. Like I said, it's classic new public management style. There's a lot of written about that, where the roles, though, of policy, purchasing, and provision at the state level are quite separate. And that just allows ministers to be able to make policy. It allows public servants to do the provision, and it allows then the provision to be done in the marketplace. Due to a variety of, depending on where you sit, failures, I guess, in the market failures, some are put at the feet of a badly designed market, some, and that's often by pro-market forces. Anti-market forces would say it's just a bad idea generally, but as a result, the regulators are actually very heavily legally regulated, and nationally recognized training products and the qualifications that have been developed by industry are also reasonably heavily regulated, which causes a lot of heartache in that. But it's a classic market. It's like buying an automobile. The motor vehicle dealers are licensed. The product, the car, has a variety of standards it has to meet, and they operate in the market. But there has developed a substantial fee-for-service market segment that supplies short courses, and those are often linked to safety and occupational regulators' requirements. And the next slide, please. Has it been effective? Well, that's the $64 million question. Because of the binary market, non-market policy construction, the analyses have tended to be either or. So you will get advocates that say the market has failed, you will get of an anti-market position, or you'll get others who say the market has worked really well, and in fact we should expand it. So the Productivity Commission set up by the Australian government consistently argues that in fact there's no role for public provision, there's no role for TAFEs in the Australian vet training market. And of course that causes some heartache to public providers. The reality is, though, now over many years, that there's thousands of small private providers and some large ones who have remained active in the marketplace for a long time. It isn't clear how long many of them last, so there has been quite a lot of churn of provision depending on how much public money is available, but nevertheless, there are people making money, which would suggest that the market is working in some areas. Certainly the public providers have lost their monopoly, which has impacted their business model quite severely, but they do continue to survive, and depending on the state government feelings at the time, they will funnel more or less money into the public provider depending on what particular outcomes the political system is seeking. So right now in this COVID environment, there's a lot of money going into public provision. Certainly the system's more efficient as the cost of instruction has gone down on $1 per hour of instruction basis. But the vet system is also shrinking with more students enrolling in universities. And some commentators link that to the market being there, because students and parents tend to understand institutions, but going to the market isn't all that clear. Finally, the question is, has it been effective? Depends on where you stand. Arguably, the market has worked well for some of those historic segments, while in others it's been an absolute failure. And so regional and remote people in particular, we haven't shifted the dial in Australia at all on increased disadvantaged groups. They remain quite poor outcomes compared to the mainstream. And clearly there's been a lot of money made or shoveled out the door, public money, into rorting of the system as each new scheme comes along and people figure out how to take advantage of it, which some would argue that if you had a market, it didn't work that way. So what you see, it depends on where you stand on the process. And thank you, Emma, for allowing me to introduce this.
Thanks very much, Don. That fantastic presentation. And now we'd like to move across to Alfredo, who is going to tell us about the system in Chile. Thanks, Alfredo.
Mute. Well,
I think you're on mute, Alfredo.
Now it's okay?
Yeah, we can hear you now perfectly. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you to the organizing team for their patience and willing to take the risk of inviting me. It's a risk because I do not speak English very well, so please excuse me if I make some mistakes. And second, because my actual job has born from the heart of marketization. So I am a serious danger. People talking about this. Just kidding. So next slide, please. That's my job. I'm the director of marketing, but in my life, I had to show you this because all these people is looking at me at this moment. It's my family, my wife Maggie, my sons Alfredo, Gabriel, and Matthew. You can guess who is the playful and naughty boy over there. And we have two pets, a hedgehog and a dog. They are their henchmen. It's a very funny group. Next slide, please. Well, I don't know if everyone knows about Chile. Like in that slide, you can see Chile is a long, narrow country in South America, West Coast. So we are 18 million people. Next slide, please. And that's my city. That's Santiago of Chile. It's rounded by mountains. We have snow. We have different kind of climates here. But the thing is, it's a very nice city. And that tower is a very, very good example to what I'm going to show you in the next slide, please. Because it shows you that we have one of the highest GDP in Latin America, but at the same time, we have one of the lowest levels of equality among OECD members. That is the first clue for what I'm going to show you in the next slide. Because when we're talking about higher education access, you have that, as Don said, this started at I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, when the law started to change, allowing the creation of private universities. Then we have a sustained increase in higher education access, but the limit was about high tuition cost. So that was a first clue for what happened next. So we have a very good, big movements, a very massive march for free education. And that's coming now. Until now, we have free education for 60% people from lowest income households. So the people is moving. The people is trying to say something about this, trying to get better levels of education, and there is it's a very good change. Marketization here in Chile, it allows a very it changed the way to give education here. In 1983, for example, we had 200,000 people studying at the higher education, but now it's 1.2 million, sorry. That is, it's a very big difference, because we are 18 millions. So sorry, I have a problem with my computer now. Right, please, next slide. So that is only a little bit of context. That is Doakusé. as you can say, we have 18 campuses. It's a professional institute with 50 years of history. We have 71 careers. It's accredited with the highest standard of quality. It's one of the 4 institutions here in Chile with the highest accredited standards. Next slide, please. It's Duocuse. It's the largest institution here in Chile. We have more than 100,000 students, more than 150,000 graduates, and that is like 20% of the. It's like the 20% of the technical education in Chile. So we are very representative of what is happening here about marketization. Please, next slide. So what about marketization? And in the next slide, you can see that we are going to start with an example. For example, this is how I see myself at work. But in the next slide is how academics see me. So because I'm talking about prospects, market share, social media, advertising, market research, and things to compete, that is like a devil. So I have 2 ways to handle it: the business way or academics way. You can see they are 2 different ways to do it. But if you show the next slide, thank you. On the business way, the business way is a way to get something, but you can choose another way that is the academics way, where people is your focus. This way, you will never lose. I had to learn that. So it's a different way to do it than in the normal industry or in a business, because you put the people in the focus. The people is your target, and you're doing another kind of work. Please, you can go to the next slide. Yes, great. Why? Because it's all about vocation, life dreams, real dreams, future, your country. So the thing is, the people is trying to look something for their future. So trust is the door, but coherence is the key. So that is very, very important, because that is where marketization starts or ends. For example, this was the reason for Massive March here in Chile, which called for free and better quality education. The real thing is that the marketization without correct policies, it's the perfect mix to convert the education system in a really good business, full of empty but profitable promises. And it's only a matter of time till the bubble explodes. And that's what happened in Chile. So Chile, in that terms, is a case of study of marketization, because for example, when you look at the third square, where it says high tuition cost, limited access, what people do to take care about that? Take a large debt. So the promise of a better future, it debts in those large debts and careers that are not the best institutions, that offering you some careers that are not that breaks that promise, but that breaks the dream that you're trusting in the institutions. So you have you have a very big problem between doing a good business or doing what is better for the students. So as I told you before, trust is the only door for taking care of this. For example, if you see in this slide, is market guilty? the real thing is market can do impossibles. Public policies are the key to give the right incentives. It's imperative to build a long-term model of education that takes care of the formation needs for the country's development. So you have another point of view. The model must guard things like inequity in access, quality and relevance of careers, tuition costs, standards, asymmetry, all kind of things that the business is not taking care about. Please go to the next slide. And marketization at Duaguse. What do we do about this? You have to put in front the role that you want to do in society. That was I had to learn when I started working here 10 years ago, because the challenge was to grow. But why do you want to do that? This institution at least want to impact on the society, want to impact to all the people who need it, but trying to do a better country. So how do you do that? Please go to the next slide. And here it starts something about marketization, because you have to take care about the enrollment, something like me. For example, a lot of years ago, we had 13,000 students, and now we have more than 100,000. So that's a big effort to try to do it, but try to do it with each of one of those students. Please go to the next slide. But so,
Alfredo.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Great. But you have to do it trying to be efficient. So taking care about variable costs of prospecting, for example, and that's when you talk with academic people, oh, it's a very weird conversation about that. Let's go to the next slide. So the secret formula was to reorder the goals with one premise. This is not a service to sell, it's an orientation process. Please go to the next slide. And this is how I understand it. You have to put a different goals. You have to do it in a different way and in another order. For example, you have the retention as a premise. You have to put the prospect at the center. It's a vocational process. But you have to take care of the efficiency, data-driven to take variable decisions. You have to take care about prestige because it takes care about the value for the graduate. So what is it's all about? It's about activity. What is the role? What do you want to have about the in the system, in the education system? Because you need to assure of working, focus it on achieving each goal. We build specific strategy for every process. I want to say that in the previous slide, there is no enrollment involved in this, because that is a very good consequence, not a goal by itself. A vocation-based prospecting have a direct impact in recommendation rate. For example, in our case, that explains almost 50% of enrollment. So please go to the next. Great. So these are our strategies, the market staff, and this sounds very, 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 very rare to academic people. But we have to put it around between marketing and communications, advertising strategy. For example, the people laugh about this graphic because they say, "Oh, hey, but it's like an education building." Yes, it's something like that. But you have to build from your your brand. But those kind of institutions are per se a very good machine of content. So you have a lot of things to say to the market, or not only to sell for enrollment. That's what I want to say. Please, next slide. So you have to take care about CRM strategy, strategy of prospecting. So you have to put your mind in taking care of process of business, but trying to do a different thing for helping the people to do this vocational process. Next slide, please. As business intelligence, it's the very, very center of the thing, because here's where you can demand modeling, tuition cost elasticity. You have very a lot of market research. You need to take care about all of this. And every year we recommend and provide extra data for the institutional definition of vacancies and tuition costs. So you have going through the heart of the business. It doesn't, this doesn't make any sense if you only talk about enrollment, about trying to do business with this. The real thing is how to impact on offering what the country needs, what the people is looking at, or where the people will have a better impact in their lives. The premise, so, and I'm finishing with this, the knowledge of the market will impact in a better vocational orientation of each prospect, and in consequence, in future students, which better probabilities to end their education successfully. That is the thing. The people to end successfully, because as I told you, they trust in you, they trust in you, their features. So you have the way to do an impact in their lives. And that is another point of marketization. That is how we put this at the center. That is how to afford it. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Alfredo.
Thank you very much.
It's an interesting point you raised earlier in your presentation about, I think, cost and quality versus what's right for students and the student experience. So just before we move to our final speaker, David Cook, we're going to just do another quick poll with you based on hearing the presentations from 2 different countries. If you could just go back, what do you think, is a question, is the marketization of the education system in your country effective? So we're just going to bring up that poll. If everyone on the webinar could answer, that'd be super, just so we get an idea of what people are thinking and how many people are from countries where maybe you don't have a marketized education system. So far, no is winning. We'll just give it another moment to see if that changes. A few more votes. Okay, I think we will close that off just there. So no just edged ahead of yes, with 17% of participants in the webinar thinking that they're still neutral about whether marketization is actually effective. So we'll move on now to our final speaker this morning, David Cork from the Association of Colleges, who's going to tell us about the system in England. Thanks, David. Could you just unmute yourself?
I thank you for doing that poll. I think it highlights where we are in England, that we are at the end of probably a 40-year experiment into the marketisation of education. On the screen, we've got a piece of research that we did with Professor Ewart Keep from Oxford University, and we did a big study on the impact of markets. And this report found a number of things. So it found us being considered sometimes the provider of last resort. It found that we'd had a big funding squeeze and declining unit price where funding was concerned. We'd seen some falling demand and throughput and productivity in some market segments. We'd seen a very high stakes accountability and intervention regime as part of, it's often a partner with a highly marketized education system. In England, just from a context perspective, it's important to know that we have a highly centralized and marketized system. So we have a market of awarding bodies that certify and provide the certificates, and it's a function that most governments deem too important to leave to the market. We've only just started to devolve funding to local authorities. They're called MCAs, or metropolitan councils. So we've barely devolved anything, and we're actually starting to track back from that with the creation of a £2.5 billion National Skills Fund. We've seen lots of reform, lots of things, constant reform in terms of the introduction of new technical qualifications, more and more apprenticeship reforms. It's a continuous feature of our system. In England, we've got lots of low quality jobs. So unemployment pre-COVID was very, very low, but the quality was always very variable. And of course, context for us all, big impending technological and occupational change. So lots of uncertainty, and very much like Don explained earlier on, we have to, for some funding streams, we don't get our grants in recurrence. We have to tender for that business. So we've then therefore opened up the market to lots and lots of private providers. So very similar in description, I would say, to Australia. With policymakers, with the Department for Education, with Cabinet Office, with lots of colleges, we asked people to imagine 3 different future scenarios by 2023. We asked them to think what the system would be like if markets rule, what the system would be like if we had markets and localities as like a mix, or whether we moved to a national education system. Next, please. And what the thing that I would like to say is about how we're held accountable in each of these scenarios. So from an accountability perspective, in where markets rule, it's about the customer and the national state. With the scenario 2, markets and localities, it's about the customer, the national state and the locality. And then in scenario 3, it's national, local, all forms of stakeholders, including employers and local federal councils, as well as the customer itself. So that was one big study that we did with Professor Hewitt-Keep, and had a big impact. The next piece of work is an unpublished piece of work that is going to be published fairly soon, and it's about actually studying the impact of excessive competition in our education system. So I'm just going to run you through the analysis. The research question is, how do we ensure a sufficient curriculum to make sure that it delivers everything that we need it to? So we've built a methodology, and we've taken all schools and colleges, and there are 326 districts. So we've calculated the market share for each institution in each district, and then created a competition index, and then classified them into low, medium, and high levels of competition. Obviously, a college will appear in each of the districts that they are present in. A district may have no colleges in it meeting a threshold, and a college might not be dominant in its home district. It might import them from other districts. Next, please. We also asked some important questions. Does competition damage outcome? Does it damage vocational or academic offer in terms of range? Does it damage institutional finance? Does it damage quality? And does rurality matter? So does it matter whether you're in an urban or a rural area? Next, please. So short version of outcomes is that we couldn't prove it either way. Because of the way that outcomes are assessed and managed by government, we have norm referencing, so the data is smoothed out, so we can't actually prove either way whether outcomes are affected by a highly marketized system. Next, please. When it comes to the range of academic courses in an area where a college is dominant versus a school being dominant, or in a dominant versus highly competitive market, the more highly competitive a market is, the lower the range of academic courses are, and the more homogenous that offer is. So actually, we lose all forms of specialization when we highly marketize a system. It makes viability of courses very, very difficult. The same applies to technical. In a tertiary system where the college is dominant in the market and has most of the market, most of the young people and adults entering into the course, the range of offer is better. So if we want institutions to specialize and respond to the needs of the market, then actually we need less competition, not more. By the way, obviously, I'm ideologically not neutral on whether marketization is a good or a bad thing. In terms of rurality, it's clearly harder to make provision viable in a rural area compared to a predominantly urban area, just because of population perspective. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and maintain a range of provision, a fabric of provision that meets the needs of the local and national economy, because obviously we export people into big cities for jobs. Next, please. In terms of cohort sizes, the more dominant in the market, the bigger the cohort sizes. It's obviously very self-evident that that would be the case. But when it comes to being actually viable, we know that it takes around 600 students for an institution to be minimally viable. And so this is just the colleges. We know that there are loads of schools. The large proportion of the schools market is unviable, and they subsidize their 16-year-old plus provision from their younger provision. So they do definitely rob Peter to pay Paul. Next slide, please. We also see the range of offer change as well. So in a dominant market where for colleges, we see much more range of provision and we see much more higher level provision. In a schools dominated market, the schools are keeping more level 3 learners and higher level learners, and they are they're keeping those, meaning that the range of offer in the colleges doesn't expand out into the higher technical courses. Next, please. Very clearly, in a dominant market, a college has much better financial health than in a highly competitive area, whether it's a schools dominated district or a college dominated district. And you see a gradient in England. So you see schools dominated markets in the south, and as you go more and more into the north of the country, it becomes a more of a college dominated market, where more, and you see also more technical provision. So you see much more technical courses being delivered in the north than you do in the south. So financial health better in colleges where they're dominant. The same applies to colleges as well. So if you move on to quality, sorry. So if you move on to the next slide, Ofsted grades, which is the quality judgments, mapped very similarly to the GFE finance data, where if you're in a GFE dominated market, your quality will be better as well as your finances. And obviously those are very tightly coupled. So there's lots of strong correlations there. We've done lots of interpretive work to make sure that that is actually the case with schools and colleges in the field as well. So I'm now going to start to talk a little bit about some solutions to some of these issues. So next slide, please. So we think that there is a big problem with the way provision is overseen. So we see the oversight of our provision in silos. So schools are regulated separately to colleges in terms of markets. So one of the things that we need to think about is commissioning provision so that it's commissioned by one person, or at least the people responsible for schools and colleges speak to each other and make sure that we don't open schools over colleges. So fragment the provision to the extent where actually one type of provider will damage the provision of another. We don't need to have some grand architect of a system. We can have a rules-based planning system, because really we don't have markets in education. We have quasi-markets. So some rules-based planning to try and promote viability and promote specialism and range of offer would be really good. Some local coordination through defining anchor institutions or outcome agreements would be really good. And we also need to provide colleges and schools with certainty. We need to make sure that they have multi-year grant settlements rather than having to bid constantly for new provision. And we don't want them to have to compete against a longer range of providers. If you bring an excessive amount of providers into the market, then that actually increases the costs for government as well to manage the system. And we're seeing more and more being spent and focused on the administration and accountability regime. And that is not really what you want or need in a market. So we're heading towards a white paper in the autumn, so it's going to be very soon. And we think that government need to do a few things. We think that they need to set priorities. They need a national post-16 strategy, because when you have a highly marketized system, you normally then don't have a TVET strategy that is linked to an industrial strategy. So we need national and local plans for the labour market, for inclusive growth and for lifelong learning. We've got 40 years of evidence that competition has not worked, and we need to plan our way out of this. We need to make sure that employers are there as partners. We need to make sure that they are there to advise and to help increase and improve productivity. And it's not just about delivering courses, it's about delivering workforce development that helps increase productivity. We need to make sure that we're seen as strategic and collaborative partners, and we need a simpler system that streamlines regulation, accountability, and funding for a new nurturing relationship. And that's me done. But one thing I can explain is that I think we've had a highly marketized system. I wanted to use an example of the Swiss education system. So I've shown you on the screen a matrix which takes the Swiss system, the current English system, and the system that we are heading to. And the Swiss system is it's very clear. It's a very easy to understand system, but the population is obviously much smaller, and it's an easier system to manage. In our in England, where we've got a large population, and it's like France, it's like Spain, it's even Germany, where skills matching isn't as easy to manage. In a large population country, marketisation will always play a part. Not completely against marketisation. I just think that we have an excessive level of marketisation that damages features of the system. So do look to the Swiss system as a more purist system-led approach, because it's a very interesting and high quality system. And I hope that that's the sort of system that we're heading to in our white paper, compared to the one that we've got now.
Thanks, David. It's good to have an example from another European country as well there, just to conclude. We have one more poll question before we take a few of the comments that have come through during the webinar. So our final question this morning is, do you think your country will change its technical and professional education model in response to COVID-19? So if I'd ask everyone on the webinar just to answer that for us, that would be really great. So far, yes is quite well ahead. Just another minute or so for people to answer that. Okay.
I think we too are seeing a more statist approach, aren't we, to education, starting to move back into that model.
That's right. So Yes was ahead there. And during the webinar, we've had a couple of questions come in and then some that were submitted in advance. So one of the questions I'd like to ask, and Alfredo, I'll ask this of you first, if that's okay, that the premise of marketization was that industry and business know best about education and training, not the people who work in education. I wonder if you could comment on that for us, please. You're on mute.
Could you repeat the question, please? I haven't heard it.
The question is about industry and business, that the premise behind marketization is that industry and business know best about education and training,
Okay.
not the people working in education as an industry. Could you comment on that?
Yes, of course. Well, I have to take some notes about this and about the presentations, but well, I don't like the premise, but I think it was the foundation idea for marketization, because if you think in, and I'm trying to think like at the beginning, industry knows what they need to be more efficient. They are experts in his fields. With the expansion of technology at the 80s, workmen were not enough to cover new job positions. Traditional educationists were not enough to transfer technical knowledge, so they don't have the work experience at the specific field to teach. So it was necessary to make profits in a short time. It seems logical that the best way to do it, it was to transfer experience and not just knowledge, to reduce the adaptation time for each worker. So, well, that is an old premise. The things have changed. As an example, for here in Chile, or at least at UAGUCE, we don't refer to teachers as teachers. We say masters, because it's more than an expert in a specific field. He's the bridge that, how to say this, that connects the knowledge with the practice. And even more, he's involved in the modeling of the person too. So, well, I don't like how to sound that, but I think that makes sense, especially at the beginning, when the marketization starts.
Super. Thank you, Alfredo. Another question that we had in advance was about markets favoring the wealthy and about us being guided by donut economics. David, can you tell us a bit about that?
I think that's a cracking question. I think that there has always been a moral limit to markets. So there are some things that markets can sort very well, and there are some things that markets can't. And the theory behind donut economics, the more circular economy, is going to be really important as we move forward, especially with the environmental agenda. It's just the difficulty is, in theory, it's great. In practice, where do we see donut economics actually occurring in the real world? So, theory, yes; practice, to be seen.
Thanks, David. The questions we had in advance, Don, I wonder if you'd mind answering this one for me, was about whether there's any experience and lessons that you can share in terms of getting out of a marketized program, or the impact of getting it right and wrong. I know you talked about the sheer volume of providers in the market in Australia. Is there any thoughts that you can share on that?
Well, David referred to some of this. I guess it depends on what value you place on institutions, would be one way to look at it. So, I mean, traditionally, one would not want to see the local school close up shop because they've gone broke. They haven't understood the market or provided appropriate outcomes or meeting the local community, particularly higher education. one would be very concerned if universities started failing as businesses. And what do you do with students in that? And I mean, certainly that was a major issue here in Australia as the loan scheme, the student loan scheme imploded, is what do you do with the students who are already registered and when the business went bust? And so raising the bar to enter the market is a very live question about how you control who's delivering in the market, but also how do you deal with business that no longer wants to be in the market? The students have to go somewhere. You have to have some arrangements. So I guess it depends on how strong one believes the importance of institutions and the longevity of institutions, where markets, in fact, by definition, would say, well, good riddance to those who don't want to be here or aren't very successful. And so there's this, almost ideological point of differences. Again, like I said, what you see probably depends on where you sit.
Thanks, Don. That's super. We had a few comments in the chat about the blurring of boundaries in education and the stronger collaboration between further and higher education, and then also comments in response to what are some of the theoretical alternatives to marketization. If I can just pick up on the point that's raised about graduates not securing jobs in marketized economies and having gone through that system, whether it means marketization's actually failed, because this should be all about the students at the end of the day. And I just wondered on the panel, what are your views on that? Does marketization work for everyone? Has it failed if people don't get a job afterwards? David, do you want to start with that?
I mean, in our system, we've got such good tracking of young people and graduates into positive and sustained destinations. One of the well-beating system in that regard. And the problem that I have with that is that education isn't just about getting people into jobs. It's got to be much more than that. It can't be entirely instrumental to the point where I worry about whether we're determining people's career choices at increasingly younger ages. So it depends on whether you believe in instrumentalism or not. And there are no straight lines. Life is not linear. I bet most of us didn't take linear paths or have moved into areas of work in our first degrees or school or college work that we did prior. So I think we've got to be realistic about actually how regimented and linear we can make and efficient we can make our system. People make mistakes. People take false starts. We've got to have some fault tolerance in the system, and also there is a limit to what institutions can be responsible in terms of the market. I mean, we've got a world pandemic at the moment, and unemployment is rife in so many of our countries. The destinations for the students in the class of 2020 will not be anywhere near as good as those in 2019, will they? But who's responsible for that? The institution or not? So it's about whether we hold people to, how strongly we hold institutions to account in terms of destinations, I think.
Super. Don, did you want to come in on that? And there's a good comment that's been made about a failure in public policy to adequately oversight the market. Would you like to comment?
Well, I'm not sure which market that comment applies to, because certainly one of the issues that here in Australia, and I think from what I read internationally, that the COVID pandemic has exposed, is that the types of employment at the end in the employment models, the business models, that particularly the caring professions or highly casualized workforces, it's been exposed that they're quite problematic. And in fact, again, the pandemic has really hit women in highly casualized, low-paid, medium skill level caring professions quite hard. So if the training providers are giving just enough training to have people to be able to enter these types of occupations, I think that it gets back to a question that, or a question about David was referring to about, well, what is the purpose? Is it just enough to barely get your foot in the door, and then we're not going to pay you very much? But also, you have to move from employer to employer. And in fact, much of the spread of the virus in Australia was initially caused by security guards and caring workers having to move from location to location to cobble together a full-time living. So I think there is a broader question about both the labor market and the training market, the provider market, as to what is that producing at the end of the day. As Alfredo referred to, is it a really good job? And that, I think, is going to be a very live question post-pandemic, or in the pandemic-facing world, whatever the right term is.
Not everybody can have a good job, can they? Though I mean, we see loads in health and social care, biggest area of delivery in English and I think UK colleges. Very labour intensive, lots of participation, lots of positive destinations, but the wage gain isn't great because we don't pay health and social care workers and nurses enough. And it's the same applies to teaching. So it's you can't. So then we go into policy areas where we start to dominate by STEM and the productive sectors, but the volume of jobs aren't there. So you have to really balance the essential services that the economy needs with the productive sectors as well.
Thanks, David. We've just got time for another 2 or 3 minutes or so of discussion. I'm sorry we can't pick up every comment or question in the chat, but it's great to see all of that coming through. And perhaps just to link 2 of the points that have been in the chat, one from Kylie Fithen in Canada about private colleges and then public providers adopting business models to allow revenue and agile responsiveness. And allied to that, the comment from Ross Digby about the freedoms of an education market include the need of the student to have adequate information on outcome, quality and price. So in a competitive market, how do we make sure that students know what choices to make, and how do they know what they're going to get? David, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, first off, there isn't perfect information, far from it. And secondly, we don't really compete in price, I don't think. If most people take on loans to take their studies forward, and actually I don't think that price is a major part of the decision making process. But as Ross points out, perfect information in a market, you have good perfect information, don't you? And we have far from that. But as he also points out, the policy is the policy world assumes that there is perfect market information. So it's just another point that we don't have. It's not a real market, it's a quasi market, I think.
Super. Don or Alfredo, would you like to make any final comments before we close today? Don?
Yeah, just generally, like I said, the ideation of the market in Australia is really quite simple. And so virtually every failure of the market is put down to imperfect information. And so the theory being that the theory will be always right. The issue is that it's not been perfectly implemented. So, that's just a leap of faith. But I guess the question to me, again, the issue here is, I think there are places where the market does work. And so and it produces better outcomes, and Alfredo was referring to that. When you look at what's happened in Chile over time in increasing access, for example, if that's a national goal. And so, but there are clearly places where the market hasn't worked. And so it seems that we need to move beyond this simple binaries to saying, let's be much more nuanced and sophisticated about this, because there are some, arguably, I mean, David and I could probably have a long conversation over a Guinness on this. There are arguably places where the colleges aren't the best answer in this space, and so it's tailoring the public policy that will give the best outcomes.
Thanks, Don. Alfredo, would you like to make any final comments before we close?
Oh, yes. I'm thinking about this time of coronavirus. It's a very good time for Tibet in general. So because this time of confinement increased and accelerate the relationship, for example, with technology. So the people can. This is a very large jump in everything about the future, and I think that what we teach, how do we form people, is exactly what we are gonna need in this time. We're gonna need people with specific competences to face it and develop it, the future. So well, I think, as Don said, market works, but I think that the difference that we can make is put the people in front, put the students at the front. It's not a normal market where I choose what I want to sell. No, we need to offer what the environment needs and what is better for the people. So that is the only thing that we have to take care about.
Thank you. Don, David, would you like to make some closing remarks?
I think I'll just follow on from my colleagues. I think that competition can be a good thing, markets can be a good thing, but I think there's a limit, and that we need to avoid having excessive competition like we've had in, I think, both England and Australia at times, and that excessive competition can be costly both to the individual, the institution, and the sector overall. So I think we just need to be mindful about where markets work and where they don't.
Thanks very much. Well, thank you everyone for participating today and sending us your comments and questions. We'd be really grateful for your feedback, and if you'd be interested to subscribe to our WFCP newsletter as well. Apologies if we haven't been able to answer all the questions, but feel free to contact us offline and we may be able to answer those for you. But thank you also to our panelists today, David, Don and Alfredo, and also to Maria, who's been doing all the technical assistance in the background. So thank you very much, everybody, and for staying with us for a few extra minutes to allow time for discussion. And we look forward to seeing you at the next WFCP webinar. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.